You know, if Space Marine was so good, why isn't there a Space Marine 2? Oh, Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 is something that I was very excited for. And in what can feel like an endless ocean of live service slop, I'm happy to say that this game is a striking return to form, rekindling the essence of an Xbox 360 era action game and weaving it into a short and sweet package that has all of the best parts of a modern video game without any of the trappings. To some extent, this is what video games should be, a tight experience that knows what it is and doesn't overstay its welcome. I'm not a big Warhammer guy by any means, but even I can tell that every inch of this game just gushes with an unquestionable reverence for the source material from Saber Interactive, the design and the presentation of not just the spaces that you'll conduct war in, but the Ultramarines, the enemy factions, the undeniable level of detail is truly a sight to behold. It's a gritty tale of a war-torn galaxy, planets under siege by endless swarms of collective intelligence bugs, and the big dudes with the big guns that conduct deadly warfare. And as I said, it feels like a throwback to an era of gaming that we haven't seen in a while. This game feels like it was made in the early 2010s, and I mean that in the best way possible. It has a cinematic, spectacle-driven campaign with a level of scale that we rarely see. It'll deliver you sights that almost seem impossible at times, and its multiplayer, a co-op campaign that runs parallel to that of the main story, giving some much-needed clarity to many of the events that transpire over the course of the game, and a PvP mode that I didn't love, but I'm sure the right people will get a lot out of. The best part about this multiplayer, however, is that it doesn't feel like it's punishing you for putting it down. Its combat system is not perfect, but does a lot to sell that ultramarine power fantasy as you cut through hordes of Tyranids with your chainsword and fight tooth and nail for glorious victory against the enemies of man. It really makes you feel like Space Marine 2. Wait, what? All in all, this is just a great video game, and I can't wait to tell you more about it. I'm James Jensen for Reset Button, and this is my review of Space Marine 2. Space Marine 2 takes place some 200 years after the events of the first game. We reprise our role as Dimitri and Titus, now serving the Death Watch as a Black Shield, an outcast from his original Space Marine chapter after accusations of heresy. Now cleared of suspicion, you are sent to Kadaku, a lush jungle planet overrun by Hive Fleet Leviathan, a spacefaring plague of Tyranids, and are tasked with detonating a virus bomb in the atmosphere to weaken their forces. Not everything goes to plan, however. Your strike team are all killed, and Titus is left mortally wounded by a Carnifex and eventually rediscovered by the Ultramarines' first company, who save his life through Rubicon Primaris, an advanced surgery that transforms him into a Primaris Space Marine, and he is sent back into the fray to fight against the enemies of mankind. If you don't understand a single thing I just said, don't worry, I didn't either. Saber is clearly incredibly knowledgeable when it comes to Warhammer 40k, and worked very closely with Games Workshop to adhere as closely to the lore as possible. I've been informed that a lot has changed in the 40k universe in the past 13 years. Saber really expects that you've done your research, and while the plot is straightforward enough that practically anyone will understand it, there are some details that I suspect might go over your head if you're not up to date or are just unfamiliar in general. Like, why do these evil Space Marines explode into confetti when I rip their heads off? If anyone knows, Let me know down in the comments. In any other game though, this uncompromising commitment to canon might actually turn some people off, but the way that this story is told and this world is put together had this sense of intrigue and mysticism to it that actually made me super interested in learning more about the 40k universe in a way that I hadn't really experienced before, and in that way, I feel this deep focus on lore is a great touch. The actual plot itself can be boiled down to a cheesy, campy military story, but man, that's Warhammer, and in that way, it feels incredibly authentic to its source material. Its cliche, big guys in big suits go to war writing really works in its favor. I definitely enjoyed this aspect of the game. It's not scared to be cool, it's not scared to be fun, and it's not scared to take itself seriously. As I mentioned, Titus was essentially missing for the better part of 200 years, and his sudden reappearance ignites a lot of suspicion in his peers, something that his superiors are acutely aware of. And apart from your quest to receive the mystical MacGuffin, Space Marine 2 is also a military-focused character drama, dissecting the turmoil created within your squad as Titus shows up to lead them, seemingly without any real explanation from those above. And yeah, for this story, the characters are written well enough, though perhaps a little simplistically at times. Character development is often as simple as, I'm suspicious of Titus and I disagree with how he conducts himself, or I'm going to kill chaos. And those things don't really move beyond that. And in that way, your squad can be a very one-note interpretation of the flawed hero archetype. A lot of the dialogue also just relates to cheesy wartime honor and duty, but then again, that absolutely works well in the context of the story. It doesn't need to be anything more. From the start of the campaign to the end, everything it shows you is just cool. Even the opening cutscene where the Death Watch is flying in on their dropship as they're overrun by winged Tyranids, everyone in the ship is just so calm and collected. They just stand completely still while they shoot at the hordes that begin to flood in from the outside. It's just awesome. And overall, it's just cool, camp, stoic, wartime shit that isn't scared of being serious. And yeah, it can be a little goofy, but that does so much to add to the charm and works perfectly in universe. It really nails that 40k feeling, at least with my limited understanding of the franchise, and it feels very short and focused, something that I feel carries across the whole experience, and I will explain shortly what I mean by that. But first, just look at this. One thing that this game hinges on is its presentation and spectacle. It's absolutely packed full of these larger-than-life moments with a bunch of larger-than-life dudes, and it really does sell the scope of a large-scale war against seemingly endless hordes of alien insects. Recent Warhammer games like Darktide captured the aesthetic well, with the sheer size of its buildings, monumental Gothic architecture, and hordes of enemies, but the way that Space Marine is able to showcase these active combat zones is something I don't think we've seen before to the same degree. It's really incredible. There are 3 main locations at the moment, with a few missions taking place on each, but the absolute commitment to detail, and for that detail to carry across at scale, it's the true touch of people with absolute reverence for the source material. It's clear as day that Saber's art designers are masters of their craft. Each location is visually distinct. The dense jungles of Kadaku, the monolithic architecture of Avarax, every space not only feels unique, but is realized in a way that feels true to its purpose. The hive worlds, the mining colonies of Kadaku, careful consideration has gone into crafting these spaces in not just a way that makes sense from a lore standpoint, but to also look so cool. And it's the little things as well. The Ultramarines' armor adorned with commendations, battle scars. War is clearly not unbeknownst to these characters, evident in their visual design alone. The subtle differences between each weapon, from bolt guns to rifles, chainsaw swords and flame weapons. Speaking of flame weapons, The encounter design in these levels really nails that cool factor as well. There's this one encounter where you're venturing into an abandoned facility and there's these rat-looking enemies that swarm at your feet, and the easiest way to deal with them is with a flamethrower. Many of these fights involve clearing the swarm of these little guys as they desperately try to overcome you. It's pretty freaky, but one of the encounters on another level is just seared into my memory. You enter a room to activate a terminal, and as you do so, the power shuts off, leaving you and your squad in complete darkness, and then the horde swarms in. The warm glow of the flame weapons as you fight waves of monsters in pitch black. They knew what they were doing. There are also these absolutely gorgeous pre-rendered cutscenes that I'm sure you've noticed so far that really evoke the glory days of Blizzard. They certainly match the quality level and in some cases surpass them. So for a game that looks this good with this many enemies on screen at a time, you'd expect it to run like complete shit. And surprise, surprise, this is absolutely not the case. Saber has utilized a lot of the technical work that they did for World War Z, their previous game, and similarly, this game is capable of rendering an absolutely gargantuan number of units, and will do so at every available opportunity. There are so many of these moments of calm that are interrupted by these huge waves of Tyranids, and their numbers are often so plentiful that it feels like they're just background dressing. But no, these are actual enemies that will actually try to kill you. It's incredibly impressive, and at least in my case, these encounters were technically polished to a shine, and performance was rock solid practically 100% of the time. What a time to be alive. Now, the game isn't bug-free. I mean, just look at all of these Tyranids. In all seriousness though, I did have one troublesome issue where I was completely unable to load into any of the co-op missions. The game would just soft lock after starting a level, sending me and whoever was in my party back to the loading dock without the ability to do anything except force quit the game. This happened to me consecutively, and I've since learned that it's a known bug relating to crossplay. So, if you plan to play with friends on another platform, buyer beware. But when the co-op does work, throughout the course of the main campaign, you'll hear Titus talking to other squads completing secondary objectives on your missions. These can be quite intricately designed. In one mission, 3 simultaneous strike teams are sent out to complete various objectives, and they are all interconnected, and the comms serve as a good point of reference when things start not going to plan. These co-op missions, operations the game dubs them, put you in the boots of those squads, a fantastic continuity point across modes, as you'll be completing those sub-objectives that you're already familiar with from the main campaign. You get to see these spaces from a completely different angle as you fight to assist Titus's squad from the other side of the battlefield. What carries over as well is the spectacle-driven nature of these missions, and while they're often not quite as impressive as those in the main campaign, I'll still say that they do a pretty good job. There's a lot of variety thrown into the mix in this mode as well. Instead of playing as Titus, you can freely pick between 6 different classes that all feel meaningfully unique and have their own progression systems and cosmetics. My favourite of these was the sword and shield wielding Bulwark, but there's also a heavy weapons specialist, a sniper, you get the idea. Their unique armor sets also genuinely look incredible, and even without these sets, there is such a deep level of customization available for those that want to sink their teeth in. You can change basically everything down to the individual paint color on shoulder guards. It's really quite cool. There is one fundamental issue with this co-op system though, and it is a big one. There are only 6 of these missions in total, and in my opinion, the level of variety on display might not be enough to support this model long term. The amount of grinding that the game expects you to do to unlock some of these cosmetics seems kind of insane to me, especially considering how little content the game actually has. For example, if you want to unlock the top armor set for a class, you'll need to run over 35 matches in some cases, in either the operations mode or PvP. Operations missions can take upwards of 30 minutes to complete, and that is one hell of a grind when you consider that the game only has around 12 to 15 hours of actual content, less than 4 of that being your first pass of operations. And apart from the different classes, you're going to be playing the same missions over and over and over, with little in the way of variability apart from different difficulties. The skill progression too, it just takes a little bit too long for me. Each class has 25 levels to grind through, each unlocking new abilities and stat boosts. The strangest decision though is that it's not just enough to unlock the level required for each ability, you also have to purchase it with in-game currency earned through completing missions. And you also use that currency to unlock cosmetic items, and it's not as free-flowing as I'd like it to be. And each class has a unique skill tree. It's a lot, but there are definitely some people that will really appreciate the depth here. It just feels a little too grindy in my opinion. The PvP as well, it reminds me a lot of Gears of War multiplayer, and in my opinion, it's Space Marine 2's weakest showing. The time to kill is frustratingly short, making these hulking Ultramarines feel a lot more like bugs to be squashed. I understand the reasoning, that it's for the sake of balance, but to me, the mode feels like a bit of an afterthought, like it's been crudely bolted onto the experience. Somewhat ironically, this also feels a lot like a throwback to some Xbox 360 single-player games, a lot of which had these bare-bones multiplayer experiences thrown in for the sake of it. There's definitely some charm to the mode for sure, but it's just not for me, and that's okay. I understand that Saber is planning on delivering more content in the future, but if you're really planning on sinking a lot of time into the experience, I would suggest waiting until that content has actually seen the light of day, as what we've got now is definitely great, but there simply isn't enough game here to justify the amount of grinding that this game demands for your unlocks, which very well might change in future. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so I can tell you more about it when it comes to pass. Now that that's out of the way, I saved the best for last. Space Marine 2 is a very linear game, and that's absolutely a good thing. The tight corridors interconnecting these open combat arenas means that there's very little downtime in between fighting, and the few moments of calm here and there feel all the more impactful when the fight gets going. And when it does get going, man, this shit is cool. In the thick of swarms of Tyranids with your squad mates, the music, the feedback of your weapons, and the gruesome execution animations, everything just comes together in this epic symphony of carnage as you fight tooth and nail to cut through these swarms. The game does a brilliant job at selling the destructive potential of the Ultramarines without ever making it feel like you're completely invincible. The vast majority of combat takes place in melee range, and Saber have done an excellent job at making sure this feels great to play. There's some weapon variety here, from a combat knife to a chainsword or an actual sword, and later in the game, the Thunderhammer, all of which feel meaningfully distinct with their own unique mechanics, animations, and combos. The chainsword, for example, is focused on these big finisher attacks, whilst the power sword has two separate stances, one better suited to single targets and the other against groups. These weapons have genuine identity to them, and they all feel great to use. Moment-to-moment combat is this flurry of clearing hordes of smaller enemies, followed by more dangerous, larger targets that can take you down very quickly if you aren't paying attention, and it's always this careful balance of target focus, parrying the larger enemies' attacks, and staying out of the line of fire of ranged enemies. You also have easily replenishable armor that is restored after not taking damage for a while, but when you're in the thick of it, you can quickly refill this armor by performing an execution. You can also refill some of your armor after a perfect dodge with this gun strike, where the camera pans in stylishly as you take a well-aimed shot at your foes. Combat feels like this incredible dance with death as your hulking Ultramarine trounces through the horde, clashing with these bigger enemies before finally taking them out in a glorious execution. Ranged combat feels pretty good as well, with a great variety of weapons, from plasma rifles with exploding ammunition, pistols, a minigun, and your standard rifles. They all feel proportionately chunky. Weapon feedback feels great. There's a real weighty feeling to pulling the trigger, and the impact of these rounds is also felt quite keenly, as smaller enemies will just pop at a distance when you shoot at them. There's also a variety of close-range weapons, which to me all felt a little out of place due to their lack of versatility, especially when your melee abilities are so strong. It seldom felt worth taking any of these weapons over your standard bolt rifle, which is sad because they all feel really cool to use. I mentioned at the start of this review that the combat wasn't perfect, and it's due to this one specific problem that starts to present itself further into the game, and that is that it can feel quite repetitive. Look, these execution animations are cool, but because executions are the only reliable way of refilling your armor mid-combat, you have to engage them at every practical opportunity if you want to stay in the fight. Enemies do the Doom style stagger and flash red when they're at low enough HP, and a lot of the time, combat can start to devolve into just running between flashing red enemies and pressing the execute button over and over and over. Again, this is generally fine most of the time, but especially as you start to fight increasingly larger groups of enemies, I feel like the combat started to feel a bit like an extended quick-time event in some specific circumstances. The execute animations are cool the first 30 times you've seen them, but do they hit the same when you've seen them 1,000 times? 2,000 times? I'm not so sure. The good news is that this problem is generally less egregious in the game's co-op, as you have to think a little more strategically as these armor refilling executions are now shared between 3 people, meaning you can't rely on them as much, and your teammates might need to use one to save themselves from a tricky fight. The co-op also generally feels more challenging than the campaign, also alleviating the issue somewhat. This is definitely a good thing, as the co-op is what Saber expects that people will be spending the most time in, and I think that's a good point to finish. I think it's a great problem to have when the biggest complaint I have about the game is that there isn't more of it. This game has been performing exceptionally well, so hopefully the cash injection will be enough for Saber to justify some long-term support for the experience, and that they can flesh out the operations mode a little bit more. I can't stress enough, the foundation here is really great. The game is just a super polished experience that feels well worth the money. I just hope that the upcoming content will alleviate some of the repetition of the gear grind. The other question I have is whether the combat model has the chops to carry this game long term, and I'm not so sure. I really enjoyed my time with it, and I definitely recommend this game as is, but by the end, I could definitely feel that repetition creeping in. Its 12 to 15 hour campaign felt like the perfect length given its mechanics, and it certainly didn't outstay its welcome. I just wonder how this game will fare for a more dedicated fanbase in future. Regardless, Space Marine 2 is just an honest-to-God, good old-fashioned video game, and it's not afraid to be just that. It reminds me a lot of the Xbox 360 glory days, the Halo 3s, the Gears of War, where games were not scared to just give you an experience and then be done with it. Space Marine 2 never feels like it's punishing you for not playing it, something that can't be said about many of the live services we have today. Its writing is cheesy, it's big guys with big suits of armor, with big guns, in a big war. And in that sense, it feels like something we haven't seen in a long time. Damn, it's so good to be back. Its presentation and world building is just immaculate, nailing the monumental architecture that Warhammer 40k is known for. Its spaces can feel so alien, yet so familiar at the same time. And the commitment from Saber to really dig deep into the lore mean that elements of this game can feel a little confusing at times to those that haven't done their homework, but I walked away from this incredibly keen to know more about this world and its factions, rather than feeling alienated because of it. Its spectacle, The short and sweet nature of it all, it's able to tell the story that the writers wanted to, and works incredibly well in this context. It really sells the intricacies of this large-scale war against an unstoppable hive mind of alien bugs and the agents of chaos. And the combat, man, the combat, the power fantasy of being an ultramarine has never been better realized than it is here, stomping through the hordes of Tyranids that swarm your feet, cutting them down with a variety of weapons that all feel unique and classes that all feel meaningfully distinct in the game's fleshed out co-op mode. There's a lot to love here despite some troubles with longevity. All in all, Space Marine 2 is a striking return to form. It truly rekindles the very essence of a 360 era third-person shooter, and it doesn't try to be anything more. That's not to say it feels old, it genuinely feels like a modern video game, but that undeniable old-school charm means that Space Marine 2, quirks included, feels like a blast from the past, and I loved every second of it, and I've no doubt that you'll love it too. Man, it feels so good to just have a good video game to play without all the bloat and the fluff. It's just great. I want to hear what you think. Let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video if you liked it. Thanks a bunch for being here. As always, hope you have the best day. See you in the next one.